Good evening, tributes, and welcome to the very final episode of Tales of the Hunger Games. I hope that everyone is well and that you have had a grand week wherever you are. Before we begin, I would like to give my usual thanks for one last time to the fabulous Andrew McLean for all the art that he has produced for this series throughout. I don't think it would have reached anywhere as near as it's got without all the art that he's made. It's been absolutely brilliant. So often I've looked at it and thought, how on earth does he do that? I'm absolutely bowled over by his talent, and I am so thankful for what he has done. And I'm also really thankful to my Patreons for having been there the whole way, giving me financial pledge. It's really been much appreciated. As usual, I think something that won't get cancelled anytime soon will be the Tales of the Hunger Games Discord, where pretty much anything to do with this series is discussed, as well as the general Hunger Games Discord, where games are still created based on your choices. Feel free to check those links out in the description. And also, I'm going to leave an attached comment on this video. If you have any of your own links or suggestions that are based on this series, please leave them next to this comment so that I can add them to future videos and so that you can all see them. So, without further ado, for the final time, let's go. In the week following District 1's games, the capital was plunged into a state of chaos after the leaked admission of President Gall's involvement in the 40-year-old disappearance of Sunita Fling and Flint Harrison, victor of the 72nd Hunger Games. This was on top of the ongoing measles pandemic, as well as the high levels of unrest that had occurred sporadically throughout the city since District 3's games. Although many citizens were pleased with Gall's decision to let the grand final continue as planned, some were not so pleased with the state of affairs in the capital, and during a large protest near Gall Manor on the Sunday afternoon, almost 100 of those present attempted to storm the building. However, many of these protesters were quickly shot and killed by peacekeepers, whilst those that survived fled. It is unknown as to why this takeover of Gall Manor had been attempted, but it allegedly left President Gall feeling rather shaken, and despite his original plan to keep the district victors isolated within Gall Manor until the grand final, he opted to move them to the accommodation tower, which he claimed would be less likely to cause another attack on his manor. Therefore, once the sun set, the 24 district victors were placed into 3 separate limousines and driven to the accommodation tower. Limousine A was attacked by an angry mob of capital citizens, but they were quickly shot and killed by peacekeepers, and the journey continued. In Limousine B, Magnus, from 2, and Bach, from 8, started fighting, but this conflict was quickly ended by the threat of the peacekeepers' guns. Meanwhile, in Limousine C, Tritica, from 9, appeared to have immense trouble breathing, with Delilah, from 12, suggesting that she was having a panic attack, but Drin, from 9, soon reassured Tritica, and she appeared to have recovered once the journey was completed. The tributes were then escorted in district pairs to their apartments. Each of the 12 apartments were guarded by a male and a female peacekeeper, who stayed within the main rooms and stopped tributes from accessing the balconies. At night, the peacekeepers were also tasked with staying in the bedroom with the tribute of their gender and watching over them as they slept. Optimo Braun and Dazzle Mortello, both from 1, were the first to enter the tower, and after a quick conversation and inspection of apartment 1, the pair began practicing with the equipment in the main room. Dazzle selected District 7's games to be shown on the screen, and she and Optimo discussed what they were seeing of Win and Olive, both from 7, whilst Dazzle shot arrows at the targets on her wall, only missing by mere centimetres, and Optimo threw knives with lightning precision at the targets on the adjacent wall. After an hour, Mirai Kobayashi, victor of the 94th Hunger Games, and Dollar Crusoe, victor of the 95th Hunger Games, entered the apartment, and after briefly checking on the well-being of their respective mentees, the dinner was served. Dollar insisted on them watching District 2's games as they ate, much to Mirai's irritation, although she did not argue when he stated that they needed to look more closely at the strengths and weaknesses of this district's victors. Following the dinner, Mirai and Dollar spoke with Dazzle and Optimo respectively in their bedrooms about their plans for the training the next day. It is rumoured that Dollar told Optimo to forget about his agreement with Dazzle, but focus on an alliance with the other careers, whilst Mirai told Dazzle to stay close to Optimo until the final 6, but to flee from the other careers if Optimo died before this point. and soon after these conversations ended, Dazzle and Optimo went to sleep. In apartment 2, Magnus Plinth and Octavia Dalton, both from 2, were clearly excited to be back in the accommodation tower, and they sparred against each other for almost half an hour. Magnus then used a holographic attack station in the corner of the main room, and Octavia shot arrows at targets on the far wall, whilst District 1's games were shown on the screen between them. During this time, Octavia branded Dazzle a coward for running at the start of the games, and Magnus expressed his wishes to kill both Optimo and Dazzle, to which Octavia replied that he could not have them both, as she wanted to have one of them as well. Rubius Dalton, victor of the 86th Hunger Games, entered the apartment soon before the dinner was served, and Octavia excitedly ran up to him, shouting "Uncle Rubius" as she embraced him. He happily embraced her as well, and shook Magnus's hand, before sitting down to eat with the pair. Octavia soon claimed that Optimo's face was putting her off her food, and so she insisted that they change the games on the screen to that of District 10. Rubius appeared to listen to both Octavia and Magnus's commentary on these games, and he said that they had both identified key aspects of the victors, but reminded them to not be arrogant, and that there would be unlikely threats amongst the other 22 tributes, with some that may have not yet shown their true colours. The pair listened as Rubius gave his opinions on all the other victors, then he ordered them to go to sleep, reminding them that the games would truly start during training the next day. Lumo Harper and Glitch Silverstein, both from 3, were the only district pair that had been stopped from seeing each other since the end of their games, although after entering apartment 3, neither of them appeared interested in communicating with the other. Glitch sat down on a sofa in the main room, and she relaxed in a leisurely manner, whilst Lumo muttered to himself as he looked in intense detail at the paintings on the wall. Glitch continued to watch Capital TV, which was broadcasting the anniversary party of the Hunger Games from Snow Square. Lumo then stood by a painting of President Snow in the corner of this room, but after briefly looking it up and down, he seemed to enter a trance and rested there, whilst Glitch occasionally looked around and seemed dumbfounded by this eerie behaviour. Almost 2 hours later, Gif Schneider, victor of the 91st Hunger Games, and Atomica Perez, victor of the 96th Hunger Games, entered the apartment. Atomica spoke to Glitch at the dining table, and she gave some advice of what to practice during training the next day, as well as ways to not attract the attention of the career tributes. Meanwhile, Gif sat down in the corner of the main room with Lumo, who was still in a trance. Whilst Gif ate, he spoke quietly about his children, but after a while he also spoke about the arena that had been used for District 3's games, and he mentioned that although the arena was not real, Lumo's victory was real, and that he could win these games. Lumo remained still, and so Gif spoke aloud about the party that he had just attended in Snow Square, but after a minute, Lumo suddenly turned towards him and asked for some of the food. Gif seemed pleasantly surprised by this sudden animation, and he took a plate of the pork from the dining table, weighing in on Atomica and Glitch's conversation as he neared them, before returning to Lumo and giving him this plate. After taking 2 bites, he jumped up and looked out the window at the skyline of the capital, while speaking loudly and quickly about the factory in which he had worked in District 3, and although Gif seemed to have trouble listening to everything Lumo said, he followed the conversation and even managed to ask a few questions in return. Once both tributes had finished eating, Atomica suggested that they head to their bedrooms, so that they were well rested for the training the next day. They both followed this advice, but soon after Atomica and Gif had left the apartment, Glitch returned to the main room, where she continued to watch Capital TV, under the watch of the female peacekeeper. Yet soon after 1 o'clock in the morning, when Glitch was the only tribute awake, loud jeers and shouts of "Tell us the truth" were suddenly heard coming from the ground outside the accommodation tower. Glitch ran over to the balcony window to see this commotion, but she was quickly pulled away by the peacekeeper, although she appeared to see a large sign that read "Glitch in the System," and she protested as the peacekeeper escorted her to the bedroom. In apartment 4, Baffin Herricks and Shell Duma, both from 4, started their evening by watching the party on Capital TV, but Shell soon became restless and said that they should try watching another district's games. Baffin did not appear to have any problems with this suggestion, but when Shell selected District 9's games, he shuddered and stated that he had had nightmares about the animals in these games, although Shell reassured him that it would be unlikely for them to be used again. During the showdown of these games, Baffin was clearly unsettled, but still watching the screen, while Shell took a piece of parchment and drew a quick sketch of Tritica becoming hysterical when she was announced as the victor. Limerick Manx, victor of the 88th Hunger Games, and Sandy Selleck, victor of the 93rd Hunger Games, then entered the apartment, with the latter complimenting them for doing their research. Sandy spoke to Shell in her bedroom and had to remove the parchment from her hands, before commenting that drawing would not help her in the games. Sandy also spoke about alliances and suggested that instead of focusing on the tributes from District 9 like Shell seemed to have planned, she should focus on the tributes from District 7 instead. Meanwhile, in the main room, Limerick asked to see if Baffin's trident-yielding skills had improved, but to no surprise, they had not. Limerick therefore asked Baffin to show what else he had been practicing, and he demonstrated his knowledge of toxicological plants and fruits, which appeared to impress Limerick, but he added that the other tributes would know that he was capable of toxicological sabotage, and so it would be difficult for him to kill tributes this way. He then ordered Baffin to try using at least one new weapon during training the next day. Up in Apartment 5, Gravito Logan and Selena Larson, both from 5, soon engaged in a loud argument, after Gravito had taken out a hip flask of whiskey from his trousers, but refused to tell Selena where it had come from. She became annoyed, and reminded Gravito that they both needed to be in good form for the training the next day. However, after some more attempted bargaining, Selena promised intimacy for Gravito if he gave her the flask. He threw it into the nearest trash compactor almost immediately, and the pair became intimate, whilst the peacekeepers remained still by the window. Once the pair had finished, Lynette Laurier, victor at the 82nd Hunger Games, entered the apartment, and Selena quickly placed cushions over her private areas. Although fortunately for her and Gravito, they were lying on the sofa and unable to be seen from the door that Lynette had entered. She quickly walked back out into the corridor, and once Selena had confirmed that she and Gravito were dressed, Lynette entered once more, and asked why they never locked the door, to which Gravito angrily asked why she never knocked on the door. However, Lynette moved the proceedings on, and asked some more questions about the pair's well-being. Although Selena seemed happy to talk with Lynette, Gravito appeared unwilling, and after realizing that she would not receive much conversation from him, Lynette suggested watching District 12's games on the screen and focusing on the victors. Selena paid close attention to the victors' strategies, but after just a minute, Gravito stormed off to his bedroom, in which he remained for the rest of the evening. Lynette seemed disappointed, but only briefly, and she advised Selena in no uncertain terms that she should look for different allies during training the next day. The games ended just over an hour later, but to Selena's surprise, Lynette ordered her to go to bed, although she did so anyway and soon fell asleep. Meanwhile, in Apartment 6, Oregon Luther, from 6, had been quietly watching the celebrations on Capitol TV, whilst Yukon Mendez, from 6, rested her injured leg and tried to stretch it in various manners in order to ease the pain. Yet after a few minutes, Yukon appeared to realize that this was not helping to relieve the pain, and she therefore took a vial of morphine from her chest pocket and swallowed it whole. Oregon watched Yukon with a dubious expression as the drug's effects quickly took hold. He said that he thought she had quit that stuff, then turned back to the screen. After a minute, Yukon's head rolled forwards, and she finally responded that she would live the last days of her life how she wanted, and to not dare tell their mentor, Madison Hawker, victor of the 85th Hunger Games. But Oregon held his hands up and asked what benefit that would bring him. When Madison entered the apartment 2 hours later, she took one glance at Yukon, who was now passed out on the sofa, before shaking her head and turning to Oregon, who was watching the screen from another. Without even checking on his well-being, Madison tested Oregon on his knowledge of toxicological and electrical substances that she had asked him to learn following his victory. He gave many correct answers to Madison's questions, but struggled with some of the harder questions for both topics that came later, although Yukon awoke and interrupted with some correct answers, which appeared to annoy Madison. Yet once Yukon had fully awoken, Madison checked her leg, and she appeared pleased to see that she was able to walk with only a slight limp. On the floor above, in Apartment 7, Win Mason and Olive Branks, both from 7, were practicing throwing spears against one of the walls that contained various targets. The pair helped each other with their holding and throwing techniques that Win's father, Lamino, had taught them whilst they were in District 7, and they seemed impressed with each other's efforts. Olive also asked for District 11's games to be played on the screen as they practiced, and several times throughout, Win commented that they should have seen it coming. Later that evening, Asher Seatle, victor of the 78th Hunger Games, entered the apartment and warmly embraced both Win and Olive, which seemed to confuse them, but before they could ask any questions, Asher said that she was sorry they had been locked up, and that this was no way to treat victors, although Olive timidly responded that they were pleased at least to no longer be in isolation. Asher then pulled out a bottle of red wine from her jacket pocket and looked at the peacekeeper present. but after noticing that he was not objecting to the presence of this alcohol, she smiled towards her mentees and said they deserved at least one drink. Wynne and Olive were appearing more bewildered by the minute, and Olive asked why Asher was being so nice to them, to which she frowned slightly, but responded that she was delighted to no longer be alone. Asher proceeded to pour the wine into 3 glasses, and handed 2 of them towards Wynne and Olive, but they looked at these glasses in a suspicious manner. Asher seemed to sense this, and after a few seconds she laughed and asked if they really thought that she was trying to drug them, but both Wynne and Olive still seemed unsure. Asher grinned and rolled her eyes, before downing her own glass from the table, and stating that she still felt fine. She continued to hold the glasses out, and Wynne exclaimed, "Screw it," then took the glass as Olive took the other. Wynne was about to drink from his glass, but Asher stopped him whilst quickly filling up her own. She then looked hesitantly towards Wynne, and after appearing to realise that she wanted him to perform a toast, he smiled and said to Ivy. With a small sigh, Olive added, to Red, and Asher followed this by saying, to all those who never came back, and the 3 clinked glasses before drinking the wine. They continued to watch the rest of District 11's games, and as Asher moved on to her 3rd glass, she told some amusing stories about the past and present mentors of this district, some of which were later proved to be true, whilst others were completely fabricated. Yet before the end of these games, Asher had fallen asleep on the sofa, and as she was asked to leave by the peacekeeper present, Wynne and Olive thanked her for the wine and helped her up from the sofa before heading to their bedrooms. Although Bach Berjac and Net Charles, both from 8, had been polite to each other during their journey to the accommodation tower, they immediately ignored each other after entering apartment 8. Bach headed to his bedroom, where it is suspected that he helped himself to a batch of morphling that he had smuggled in, whilst Net watched District 2's games on the screen in the main room. She seemed somewhat phased and scared by what she was witnessing, but persisted to make notes on the strategies, strengths, and weaknesses of both Octavia and Magnus, whilst appearing to think of strategies that she could use to exploit their weaknesses. After an hour, Ava Berwick, victor of the 81st Hunger Games, entered the apartment whilst the dinner was being served. Then she and Net embraced and seemed very pleased to see each other. Whilst they ate, Ava asked Net many questions about the isolation and her current well-being, but Net appeared much more interested in discussing the lives of Ava's children, and she was very pleased to see some pictures of them that Ava had apparently promised to bring with her. After noticing that Net had been watching District 2's games, Ava gave some advice on how she believed that Octavia and Magnus could be defeated, and she mentioned that their arrogance was one of their biggest weaknesses. Once the games ended, Net began to watch the celebrations on Capital TV, and Ava went to see Bach in his bedroom. However, after listening outside the door and then knocking, Bach shouted to go away, which Ava proceeded to do. As she re-entered the main room, Net asked what Bach was doing, but Ava replied that she did not want to know. Up in apartment 9, Dring Green, from 9, watched the celebrations on Capital TV, whilst Tritica MacDonald, from 9, sat by the peacekeeper and quietly looked out the window. Every once in a while, Drin asked if Tritica was feeling fine, and she briskly nodded back, before looking out the window again. Yet when a hovercraft flew over the tower later that evening, Tritica gasped, turned away, and covered her ears, although Dring quickly led her away from the window and assured her that the craft would not hurt her. When the dinner was served soon after, Chief Jaworski, victor of the 87th Hunger Games, entered the apartment and immediately congratulated the pair once more for their victories, before giving them good news about their families back in District 9, even though some of this information was later proved to be incorrect, with Tritica's sister having died a few days earlier in a cropper collision. Once the trio had finished eating, Chief said that he wanted to watch one of the games with Drin and Tritica so that they could start to think for the games, and both tributes initially objected, but Chief insisted on District 8's games that he claimed to be less horrific. Tritica initially struggled to watch these games, holding her hands over her eyes and whimpering when the bloodbath and other deaths were shown. Drin quietly asked if Tritica should have to watch these games, to which Chief responded that she needed to become reaccustomed for the grand final in 3 days, to which Drin hesitated but did not object. Once the games were over, Chief told Tritica that she could go to bed, which she did without another word. Chief then spoke to Drin a little more over a glass of whiskey, and he reminded him to look for allies and weaknesses amongst the other tributes, before sending him to his bedroom once they had finished their glasses. Tobe Hooper and Clara Paranova, both from 10, seemed defeated during the journey to the accommodation tower, and this did not change once they arrived in apartment 10. They barely spoke to each other as they watched the celebrations on Capital TV, until Clara began to cry, and after noticing her, then looking back to the screen, Tobe rudely asked how these monsters could celebrate the games. It was also noticed that he had to reposition himself several times to watch the screen more easily due to the lack of vision in his right eye following District 10's games. Michelle Onassis, victor of the 54th Hunger Games, entered the apartment when dinner was served an hour later. She immediately told them both to lighten up, and that they were not dead yet, before reminding Clara that her sister, Anna, had died for her to be here, which appeared to unsettle both Clara and Tobe, but they each seemed more present following this intervention. As they began to eat, Michelle also made some negative comments about the celebrations on the screen, before turning it off and testing the pair on their knowledge of herbal toxicology. They managed to answer some questions correctly, but both seemed tired, and Michelle soon allowed them to finish their food in peace. Casco Astriana, victor of the 98th Hunger Games, entered the apartment shortly after they had finished eating, and he asked to speak to Tobe, who asked if this was really necessary. However, Michelle beckoned him to accept this request, and Casco tried to convince Tobe to perform to the best of his ability during the training tomorrow, but soon after Tobe replied that this was easy for Casco to say, a loud argument erupted within the apartment that resulted in the peacekeepers needing to separate the young men from each other. As Casco was removed from the apartment by peacekeepers, Clara began to cry, and she scurried off to her bedroom before locking herself in and not even allowing Michelle to speak to her. Meanwhile, Tobe held ice against a bruise that he had just received on his forehead, but he continued to watch the celebrations in Snow Square while snarling at the screen. In apartment 11, Thibaut and Begonia Girardo, both from 11, began the evening by watching the celebrations on the screen. Begonia soon became delirious and asked how capital citizens could celebrate these games, but Thibaut massaged her shoulders and tried to calm her, although Begonia still seemed agitated. Easter Rollix, victor of the 83rd Hunger Games, and Delphine Dubois, victor of the 92nd Hunger Games, entered the apartment an hour later and happily embraced both tributes. The dinner was then served, and whilst they ate, the quartet had a seemingly pleasant conversation about Begonia and Thibaut's controversial wedding ceremony that had occurred 2 weeks earlier, and Begonia's mood seemed to improve to some degree. After this meal, Easter spoke to Thibaut in his bedroom about the biggest threats towards both himself and Begonia, the latter of which he believed to be Octavia. Easter also said that both Thibaut and Begonia would need to keep a close eye on all the careers during training the next day. Meanwhile, Delphine spoke with Begonia about a range of issues, none of which related to the games, although someone named Daisy was often mentioned during this time. Finally, on the top floor of the accommodation tower, in apartment 12, were Restoro Diggs and Delilah Undersea, both from 12. The pair spent most of the evening making casual conversation with each other about the celebrations on Capital TV and the situation back in the land formerly known as District 12. Restoro and Delilah's mentor during the district games was Gale Hawthorne, but he was now technically no longer a citizen of Panem, which stopped the capital from being able to bring him to the accommodation tower. Therefore, Restoro and Delilah were not visited by a mentor, and after eating their dinner, then having a brief conversation about their objectives during the training the next day, they simply retired early to their bedrooms and fell asleep soon after. The next morning, the tributes were taken in a total of 6 limousines to the training centre, during which time there were fortunately no incidents to report. The amount of peacekeepers in the training centre was 3 times larger than what it had been in previous weeks, and they were each armed with tasers, whilst the mentors watched from the mentoring gallery. Once all tributes were ready and waiting in the middle of the training centre, Rubius entered the floor to address them. He stated that he would not apologize for the hardship that tributes had endured in order to reach this stage of the games, but that he still commended them each for their victories. Rubius then explained that tributes should be familiar with each other by now, and they should therefore use this training time to focus on overpowering their opponent's strengths, whilst also compensating for their own weaknesses. He added that any controlled combat would have to be supervised by peacekeepers, before dismissing the tributes to the stations of their choices. Yet whilst most of them scattered in different directions, Lumo appeared phased and intimidated, and he jolted his head around in an erratic manner, before muttering, "This can't be real," to himself every few seconds. As Lumo started tapping his forehead as well, Rubius slowly approached and looked at him with a curious yet amused expression. Lumo then spotted Rubius from the corner of his eye as he headed to the exit door, but peacekeepers quickly stood in Lumo's way, whilst his breathing became faster. Yet as Lumo turned back around, he shouted that Rubius was also not real, before kicking his shin. Lumo then began to run towards another exit, but this had clearly angered Rubius, who immediately shot him in the back with a taser. As Lumo's whole body violently shook against the floor, Rubius slowly approached, grinned, and asked if this was real. Lumo continued shaking uncontrollably, and was clearly unable to speak for the next 30 seconds, until Rubius finally deactivated the taser. He then walked back towards the centre of the floor, while sniggering to himself about what had just happened. Lumo was subsequently hoisted up by some of the other peacekeepers, and dragged to the nearby aquatic station, where he appeared to recover as he looked into one of the tanks of water. During this incident, Optimo was seen to shake his head in disbelief as he walked away with Dazzle, who watched in surprise and quietly commented that she did not realize how powerful the taser was. They then made eye contact with Magnus and Octavia, to whom they had been introduced during their journey to the training center. Magnus and Octavia still seemed amused by Lumo's failed escape, but Magnus managed to stop laughing for enough time to ask if Optimo and Dazzle would like to try sparring against each other in order to experience each other's fighting styles. Both Optimo and Dazzle seemed hesitant to this request, but they accepted, and the boys fought each other on one piece, whilst the girls used the other. The fights of both genders were close, but they ultimately saw Magnus and Octavia, who seemed slightly stronger, overpowering Optimo and Dazzle and coming out on top. The pair from District 2 gave each other a brief look of amusement as the peacekeepers on both pistes announced them to be the winners, but Dazzle then asked if they would like to compare skills in the spear station, and Octavia quickly accepted for both herself and Magnus. The four careers took turns throwing 15 spears at a selection of targets for 2 minutes each, and once they had all completed their turns, it was Optimo who was announced to have scored 96% accuracy, whilst Dazzle and Magnus received 94%, although Octavia was clearly annoyed to have only scored 93%. However, she insisted that they proceed to the archery station, where she scored 97% accuracy, whilst the other three careers did not manage any higher than 94%. After these results came through, Dazzle suggested that they took a break, and for the next 10 minutes, they looked around at the other tributes in the surrounding stations. Octavia licked her lips as she watched Olive in the survival station, and Optimo appeared to notice her reaction and nudged Dazzle. As she looked over to see Octavia focusing on Olive, Dazzle asked if Octavia wanted to go to this station next, and she responded that she did not, but that she did want to be the one that kills the 7 girl, to which Magnus pointed at Bark lazily completing the obstacle course, before saying that he wanted to have that 8. Magnus then asked Optimo who he wanted to kill first, to which he replied that he would kill whomever he needed, and Magnus turned to Octavia, who sneered back towards him. Meanwhile, Gif had shot an exasperated look at Rubius after he tasered Lumo, who climbed into one of the aquatic station's tanks and spent the next hour floating on the water's surface, whilst closing his eyes and appearing to mumble to himself. As for Glitch, she did not acknowledge what was happening to Lumo, but headed straight to the electrical station. Unlike her initial training, she appeared to have some trouble building several basic circuits, but with the help of the robotic instructor, she quickly refamiliarized herself with what she was doing and soon managed to build these circuits once more. After almost half an hour, Selena also came to the station, where she and Glitch simultaneously tried to build the circuits that the instructor was ordering. Selena received an electric shock within a few minutes, but Glitch helped her and gave some extra advice, including covering her fingers with clothing when she touched the wires. Selena appeared to appreciate Glitch's help, and they began to work together in order to produce some more circuits. The girls even started laughing when the instructor began to rotate quickly with his hands in the air, whilst repeatedly shouting the letter U, until a peacekeeper rushed over to fix it. Selena asked Glitch a little about District 3, but she was more interested in asking Selena about District 5's games, and the district itself, and within an hour, the pair seemed to have created a firm bond and possibly an alliance. As for Baffin and Shell, they headed straight to a tank containing fish that was built into the ground of the aquatic station, without appearing to notice the incident involving Lumo. The pair tried to spear the fish in this tank for half an hour, whilst discussing why Lumo was floating in the adjacent tank. Yet after this time, Baffin moved to the Trident station and practiced with him, but with little success, which caused Limerick to cringe from the mentoring gallery, whilst Tobe laughed from the nearby fencing station. As Shell continued in the aquatic station, Drin also practiced in the Trident station, which soon led to him and Baffin making conversation. Although neither of the boys appeared to improve their trident-yielding skills much during the next hour, they shared some banter and common interests, before discussing each other's games and the isolation in Gaul Manor. Gravito had appeared rather shocked by what had happened to Lumo, and he muttered to himself in disbelief as he headed to the strength station, while Solina simply ignored the incident and headed to the toxicological station. Yet after appearing to have trouble mastering the various skills needed for the station, she moved to the electrical station instead, where she proceeded to work with Glitch for most of the next hour. Meanwhile, Gravito was piling on more and more weights to the bar that he was lifting in the strength station, whilst not appearing to pay any attention to the other tributes that were watching him during this time. However, this also stopped Gravito from noticing that Magnus and Octavia seemed rather impressed as they watched him from the archery station. Oregon had moved straight on from Lumo and towards the toxicological station, where he appeared to watch Selina and be amused by how annoyed she was becoming with the identification machine. Yet as Oregon continued to improve his skills here for the rest of the morning, Yukon lazily rested in the survival station and did not do much with the resources provided, but sat in a daze and watched the career tributes instead. As for Wynne, he paid no attention to Lumo, but headed straight to the axe-throwing station, where he appeared pleased to show his strong skills in front of the other tributes, many of whom looked impressed. Although Tritica seemed rather fearful when Wynne glanced at her passing the station, Asher was noted to be grinning proudly towards the other mentors within the gallery. Meanwhile, Olive began the morning in the axe-throwing station, but after a brief amount of time, she moved to the survival station, where Net was creating a wicker basket. Olive managed to start a fire with relative ease, before creating a shelter with a range of differently sized branches. Although she soon appeared to have difficulty with this task, Net came over and helped her by tying these branches together with leaves, which appeared to surprise yet impress Olive. She then spoke a little more to Net about their respective districts, and after a while Net said that she could teach Olive anything about fabrics if she could teach her how to throw an axe. Olive seemed pleased with this offer, and responded that she would not be able to make anyone an expert in this time, but that she could show Net the basic techniques. As for Bark, he watched in shock as Lumo was tasered, then argued aggressively with the nearest peacekeeper. They duly ordered him to move away to a station, and it was only when he too was threatened with a taser that he finally headed to the obstacle course. However, Bark completed the course in a lethargic and slow manner, which ultimately caused another peacekeeper to taser him. After the taser was deactivated, Bark angrily claimed that this peacekeeper had broken his back, and he quickly jumped up to attack her. However, this caused yet another peacekeeper to taser Bark, and following a signal from Rubius, he was forcibly removed from the training center, before being placed into an isolation pod for the rest of the day. Meanwhile, Drin had briefly appeared worried after seeing Lumo shaking on the floor, but he proceeded to the obstacle course, which he completed in a respectable time. After a while, Bark also came to the station, but even when Bark was later tasered by the peacekeeper, Drin maintained focus and completed the course in a faster time. As for Tritica, she appeared rather fazed by the sight of Lumo being tasered, and she asked what was happening to him as Clara walked past, but she ignored Tritica and continued ahead. Tritica appeared more worried as she saw the careers beginning to spar against each other, and after some hesitation she headed to the nearby fabric station, where she continually ran her hands slowly across the different fabrics, and this gradually seemed to calm her. Meanwhile, Clara had hurried past Tritica and towards the toxicological station, where Solina and Oregon were also working, but she appeared to ignore them both and focused on her own practice, which went rather well, and she managed to identify some of the most ambiguous toxic plants present on the screen. As for Tobe, he immediately looked away from Lumo as he lay shaking on the floor. He then moved to the fencing station, where he practiced against a holographic figure and did surprisingly well against its hardest setting, even appearing to impress the careers as they looked in his direction. Meanwhile, Begonia alerted Thibaut to Lumo as he lay shaking on the floor, but Thibaut quickly moved her along to the camouflage station, whilst whispering not to worry. The couple painted each other's hands, feet, and faces in a range of colours, and this appeared to calm Begonia and even amuse Thibaut. During this time, they also watched the other tributes, including the careers, and it was noticed that Thibaut was keeping a very close eye on Octavia when she was excelling in the nearby archery station. As for Delilah and Restoro, the former seemed to panic slightly upon seeing Lumo shaking near her, but as another peacekeeper approached her with a taser as well, Restoro led her away towards the medical station. Delilah still appeared slightly dazed and sullen as she looked around at the other tributes, especially when she looked across the floor to the careers, who were now sparring against each other. However, Restoro soon distracted Delilah by activating one of the robotic corpses in the station, which proceeded to order them to remove its pancreas, and whilst Restoro appeared more fazed by the robot's voice, Delilah went ahead and completed the assigned task in a record time. In fact, for the next hour, she managed to remove a benign tumour from the corpse's leg, and even a jagged piece of metal from its arm, without causing any further tissue damage, which greatly amazed Restoro as he struggled to stop the bleeding on the arm of the other robotic corpse. Yet after just over an hour of the training time, Yukon appeared to become scared within the survival station, and as loud clanging occurred from the nearby fencing station, she got up and breathed erratically for a few seconds, before limping towards the exit to the training center. Yukon tried to push past the peacekeepers in front of this door, but they held her back and brandished tasers when she refused to head back to a station. Madison quickly came down from the mentoring gallery and entered the floor without permission, but Rubius gave a signal to the peacekeepers to allow her to stay. Yukon then said to Madison that she desperately needed air, and after briefly bargaining with the peacekeepers, Madison was allowed to take her outside. Although Madison proceeded to speak in a calm and reassuring manner, Yukon still appeared upset and panicked. After 10 minutes, the peacekeepers told them to re-enter the training center, but after putting his hand on Yukon's shoulder, she suddenly jolted around and smacked him in the side of the head, before kicking him in the groin. This led to 2 other peacekeepers sprinting outside to control the situation, and Yukon was knocked down and tasered, then taken away and placed in an isolation pod, whilst Madison was escorted back to the mentoring gallery. Octavia had laughed at Yukon's limp as she hobbled to the exit of the training center, and Magnus jokingly asked how training could help her when she clearly had no chance of winning. Yet Optimo then turned to Magnus and asked if he had ever seen the 71st Hunger Games, before moving to the spear station, whilst Octavia asked which games these were. After finishing his discussion with Octavia, Magnus moved to the fencing station and performed strongly against a peacekeeper. Gravito was already in the spear station, where he was performing relatively well, but Optimo soon joined him and showed brilliant accuracy for the rest of the morning, which clearly intimidated Gravito, although he appeared to ignore Optimo as much as possible. Meanwhile, Dazzle and Octavia remained in the archery station, and as Octavia improved her accuracy even further, Dazzle watched Annette helping Olive in the fabric station. Octavia asked Dazzle why she was watching them, to which she replied that she had learned to never underestimate the enemy. Octavia seemed to understand, before asking Dazzle which one of the girls she would most like to kill in the arena. Dazzle seemed slightly surprised and hesitated, but replied that she would strangle Net and Olive simultaneously with the sheet of linen fabric that Net was holding at the time, to which Octavia paused and grinned, before stating that this was an interesting choice indeed. Meanwhile, Lumo had suddenly reanimated in the aquatic station, and he got out of the tank, then moved down to the electrical station, where Glitch was still building light circuits with Selena. Both girls seemed to ignore Lumo as he began building motor circuits at the opposite end of the station, but after a while he looked intently towards them and mumbled to himself, before focusing intently on Glitch, even though he had barely looked at her in apartment 3 the previous night. Selena noticed Lumo, and she whispered to Glitch that he was looking at her. Glitch looked up at Lumo, but before she could say anything, he pointed at her and repeatedly shouted, "She's not real," which alerted some other nearby tributes. Glitch appeared more annoyed than scared by this outburst, as Selena looked at her in confusion and asked why Lumo was shouting this. He also began to shout that Glitch was a wire woman, and he darted around the table towards her. Glitch let out a small gasp, and 2 peacekeepers quickly approached Lumo from behind, then tasered him discreetly, before quietly removing him through the nearest exit door, and without any further delay, Glitch and Selena continued their practice, like nothing else had happened. Meanwhile, Shell seemed to be affected by Yukon's panicked episode, and it even caused her to appear anxious herself. However, Shell appeared to breathe deeply for a few seconds, and closed her eyes, before moving to the camouflage station and marvelling at the array of paints and backgrounds. She dipped her fingers in black paint, and drew what appeared to be a generic figure on a light blue background, but after a while her attention seemed drawn to Optimo, who was grunting rather loudly as he exerted himself in the spear station. Shell then concentrated deeply as she drew Optimo with red paint, and after an hour this had been done surprisingly well, even though Sandy appeared to become annoyed as she watched from the mentoring gallery. Baffin continued in the Trident station for the next 20 minutes with Drin, who then asked if Baffin wanted to practice in the Scythe station. He agreed, and Drin demonstrated how to use a scythe most effectively against both another tribute and a field of corn, Although Baffin initially appeared to have trouble using this weapon, he focused on what Drin was saying, and eventually managed to cut some corn in a way that Drin described as brutally sharp to the touch. Meanwhile, Oregon had noticed Yukon's outburst, but he did not react, and simply continued using an identification machine in the toxicological station. He improved his knowledge of both fruit and plants over the late morning, and even received the highest score so far for identifying these substances. As for Wynne, he had taken a break in the axe-throwing station, during which he appeared to be watching Restero and Delilah performing operations on the robotic corpses in the nearby medical station. After a while, the pair appeared to realize that Wynne was watching them, and Restero said that he was impressed with Wynne's axe-throwing abilities, before asking how long he had been using an axe. Wynne thanked him, and responded that he had been chopping wood since before he could remember, which appeared to surprise both tributes from District 12, but Delilah in particular. Wynne then asked what they were doing to the corpses, and Restero said that they had just been tasked with removing poison from one of the livers, before asking if Wynne wanted to see, and after a brief pause, he replied, "Why not?" He seemed somewhat faint as he looked at the organs within this body and the amount of fake blood that was present, but once he appeared to have accustomed himself, he was clearly rather fascinated by what both Restero and Delilah were doing. As for Olive, she and Net had both appeared shocked by Yukon's escape from the training center, but they soon moved on. Olive then showed Net how to hold and throw an axe most effectively, and after an hour, Net was at least able to throw an axe in the general direction for which she was aiming, but it also became clear that she would be unlikely to use an axe as a weapon within the games. Net then took Olive to the fabric station, where she managed to sew together a scarf from different linen fabrics within 5 minutes. Olive appeared impressed by the speed of this construction, but Net then impressed her further by creating some makeshift armor from netted tights and beads that proved to be a decent barrier against an axe that Olive brought over to this station. Meanwhile, Tritica was still clearly scared of the events around her, but after noticing how upset Yukon had become, she actually appeared to come to her senses, and moved to the obstacle course that she completed in a relatively fast time, and Sheaf was noted to be nodding and smiling at her from the mentoring gallery. After completing the course a few more times, Tritica even looked up at Sheaf and smiled back. As for Clara, tears formed in her eyes as she watched Yukon being stopped from leaving. She then moved to the archery station, which was the only weaponry station that was free at the time, and she spent the rest of the morning trying to improve her archery skills, but it was clear that she was not putting in a decent effort or even focusing on what she was doing. As for Tobe, he had not even looked towards Yukon as she left the center, and he continued to focus on his efforts in the knife-throwing station, where he was improving his accuracy by the minute, although this soon appeared to attract the attention of Magnus, who was watching him closely from the other side of the training center. During this second half of the morning, Thibaut and Begonia had remained in the survival station, where they took turns attempting to create fires, whilst inconspicuously watching the other tributes. Begonia tried to help Thibaut make a fire during this time, but when he continually had trouble and became annoyed, she seemed amused, and this in turn led Thibaut to jokingly insult Begonia whenever she laughed at his efforts. A small midday break followed, during which the tributes were allowed to eat. Yet after just 20 minutes, they were ordered to recommence their practice, and most tributes returned to the stations that they had been using before the break. This included Tobe, who quickly lined up 10 knives that he wished to throw in unison at the targets ahead of him. Yet just before he was about to throw the first knife, Magnus casually marched over and took 3 of these knives that he began to throw at the targets as well. Tobe quickly asked what Magnus was doing, and he told him to take some of the many other knives that were available, but Magnus ignored Tobe, and a physical confrontation followed, which saw peacekeepers intervene before the boys were able to harm each other with the knives. Whilst they were restrained by these peacekeepers, Magnus said that he wanted to fight Tobe in the sparring station, but before Tobe even had the chance to respond, Rubius ordered for them to be taken to the station. Many of the other tributes watched as Tobe tried to put up a respectable fight, but Magnus was even more muscular and far more skilled in the art of hand-to-hand combat, which allowed him to knock Tobe to the ground 7 times over the next 5 minutes. When the ending bell finally sounded, Magnus casually walked away towards Octavia, whilst a severely bruised and bloodied Tobe lay on the floor, and at this time he appeared incapable of opening his functioning eye. Optimo appeared surprised by how thoroughly Magnus managed to beat Tobe, and within a minute he had headed to the knife-throwing station, where he focused deeply as he began to practice. Dazzle remained in the nearby endurance station with Olive, and the girls courteously smiled to each other, but did not communicate further. Dazzle watched Optimo as she ran, but as she noticed him becoming more and more focused, she walked over and joined him, then asked how he was feeling. Optimo asked if Dazzle really cared, to which she grinned and replied that this was a silly question, and that he was her ally. Optimo continued throwing knives, but he still seemed to be listening, and Dazzle stated that an alliance was not just about fighting others, but also supporting each other. Optimo finally stopped throwing the knives and thanked Dazzle, to which she said that he was welcome, and she joked that the twos seemed strange, and that Octavia in particular was an arrow without a bow, to which Optimo let out a quiet chuckle. Meanwhile, Octavia had been watching Magnus's fight against Tobe from within the viewing crowd, and her laughter seemed to worry some of the other viewing tributes, but most notably Clara, who stood to her right. However, when Octavia asked in a threatening tone if she too wanted to fight, Clara quickly scurried away, and Octavia cheered on Magnus until the fight was ended. As the other tributes scattered, Octavia sniggered at Tobe and congratulated Magnus as he left the sparring station. The pair then sauntered around the training centre for the rest of the afternoon and laughed at the other tributes' efforts, whilst openly mocking some of them as well. Octavia and Magnus also appeared intrigued by what Thibaut and Begonia were doing in the survival station, which caused Thibaut to ask why they were looking at them, but Magnus was surprisingly polite to him in return, and simply said that he was having a gander, before moving on with Octavia. As for Lumo, he remained in the electrical station, where to the confusion of the nearest peacekeeper and several other tributes, he spent the rest of the day frantically building the same thermal circuit, then taking apart its components and placing them back together in a repetitive cycle. This made Octavia laugh as she walked past with Magnus, but after watching for almost 5 minutes, Magnus insisted that they move on, and Lumo did not even appear to notice that they had been watching him. Meanwhile, Glitch and Selena were shocked by the fight, and once it ended, they quickly moved to the spear station, where they tried to improve their aim, but spent more time watching Win and Baffin in the adjacent axe-throwing station. However, Selena also appeared to become rather tired during this time, and she spoke to Glitch about her problems with having Gravito as a district partner, which appeared to amuse Glitch to some degree, although she was clearly struggling not to show this. Gravito came over soon after, and asked Selena how she was feeling, to which she responded that she felt fine. Gravito then signed to Selena, asking why she was bothering to ally with Glitch, but Glitch herself signed back to Gravito that they had already learned a few new skills from each other, and that this alliance had benefited them both. Gravito seemed slightly awkward that Glitch had understood him, and he quickly excused himself. Selena seemed amused, and quietly asked if Glitch now saw what she meant, to which she nodded. The girls then moved to the obstacle course, which they both completed in respectable times over the rest of the afternoon. Shell also watched the fight between Magnus and Bark, but before it had ended, she was already moving back to the aquatic station, where she spent the rest of the afternoon stabbing the fish in an aggressive manner, and appearing to mutter to herself about blood as she did so. As for Oregon, he had not watched the fight, but he finally appeared to become bored at the toxicological station, and he moved to the electrical station, where he seemed to be trying to ignore Lumo, even though he appeared to be distracting and even scaring Oregon. As soon as the fight ended, Wynne returned to the axe-throwing station with Restoro and Delilah, but shortly after he began to show them how to throw the axes, they were joined by Baffin, Net, and Drin, who asked if they could also watch Wynne's demonstration, and after a brief hesitation of apparent surprise, he agreed. Wynne then showed how to grip and throw an axe most accurately, and the group each attempted to copy his technique with mixed levels of success, although Delilah and Drin were clearly the most accurate in their axe throwing. All 4 career tributes appeared interested in the events of this group session, during which the tributes involved appeared to have conversations regarding their home districts, mentors, and other subjects, whilst even laughing and joking with each other, and Wynne was thanked at the end for sharing this skill. Meanwhile, Tritica remained in the obstacle course, which she completed with progressively slower times, until eventually resting still on the monkey bars. While she hanged on to these bars, she closed her eyes and simply swayed back and forth for almost 10 minutes. Other tributes appeared confused as to what Tritica was doing, but also impressed by her ability to hold on to the bar for so long. Olive noticed Tritica from the axe-throwing station, and after speculating about how long she had been hanging on to the bar, Restoro suggested that they see what she was trying to do. Olive and Restoro therefore approached the obstacle course, and Restoro asked Tritica if she felt alright. She slowly opened her eyes and simply nodded, whilst continuing to hold on to the bar. Olive then commended Tritica for bravery in fighting the aliens during her games, and she silently looked back at Olive for a few seconds, before quietly thanking her and smiling as she continued to look down at the pair. Silence resumed, but Restero asked if Tritica would like to join them in the axe-throwing station. She appeared to be thinking deeply, before eventually dropping from the bar and joining Olive and Restero. Then the trio walked back to the axe-throwing station, where Tritica did not throw any axes, but she watched with interest as the others in the group did so. As for Clara, she had fled after being confronted by Octavia, and she idly milked the robotic cow in the bovine station, whilst appearing shaken by all the events that were happening around her. The cow even instructed Clara to milk its udders faster, but she only slightly increased her milking rate, and seemed more concerned with hiding herself behind this cow. Yet after a few minutes, Tobe approached and snarled at Clara, while she gasped at his bruised and bloodied face. Tobe told Clara to come with him to the toxicological station, and she followed him without any apparent protest. They then worked together in the station, and Tobe ordered Clara to show him as many toxic substances as she could, and while she proceeded to do this, he paid close attention and quietly mumbled to himself things like "not gonna die like this" for the rest of the afternoon. Meanwhile, in the survival station, Thibaut rested and tried to construct a shelter, whilst Begonia seemed to relax and even fall asleep. Yet with 10 minutes left of the training time, one of the peacekeepers entered the station and told Begonia to wake up. Thibaut watched carefully as she slowly opened her eyes, but she sleepily claimed that she was tired, before turning over once more and ignoring the peacekeeper, who stomped forwards and shot her in the back with his taser. As Begonia began to shake against the ground, Thibaut roared, jumped up, and tackled this peacekeeper against a tree, which sounded a loud crack as its helmet hit a branch. Thibaut shouted obscenities about not hurting his wife, and another peacekeeper ran into the station, but before he could even bring his taser from his pocket, Thibaut jumped forwards and knocked him to the ground, then pummeled his head with such force that the glass on his helmet broke. Rubius quickly entered the floor and pressed a button that appeared to electrocute Thibaut's tracker, which was still in his arm from the district games. Thibaut collapsed and Rubius turned the button towards Begonia, who was now looking up in a daze and crying in anguish as she held her back and stomach. Many mentors in the gallery were clearly unnerved by what they were seeing, including Delphine and Easter, who shouted at Rubius to not taser Begonia. Yet order was only restored when the 4 peacekeepers in the gallery pointed their tasers at Delphine and Easter, then to the other mentors. Ava tried to reason with the peacekeepers to not shoot their tasers, but one of them marched forwards and shot his taser into her chest. As Ava yelped and collapsed, Dollar, Limerick, and Madison suddenly attacked the nearest peacekeepers to them, and a fight was triggered between many other mentors and peacekeepers who were in the gallery at the time. This led to a few of the mentors being tasered, but more harm was committed against the peacekeepers themselves. Meanwhile, most of the tributes were at first alarmed by the incident in the survival station, before hearing the commotion occurring in the gallery above. Shouts of support then flowed across the floor of the training centre, and several of the peacekeepers threatened the tributes with their tasers. Yet upon looking around at the chaos occurring on the floor around him and in the gallery, Rubius quickly pulled a pistol from his pocket and shot it towards the ceiling. All fights that were still occurring suddenly stopped, and Rubius loudly warned that he would shoot between the eyes next time. He declared that training was now over, and within a minute, all tributes had been escorted from the centre by the peacekeepers, whilst the mentors were kept under guard within the gallery. The tributes were ordered to go to sleep early that night, and this allowed them to awaken before sunrise the next day. Over the morning and early afternoon, they were prepared for the evening's interviews by Pixie the Avox and her team of stylists, who bathed, groomed, and dressed each pair of tributes in an outfit that suited their district's produce. During this time, there were debates within various apartments regarding how a simple interview outfit could create the best representation of each district, but the final decisions were ultimately made by Pixie. Some tributes also requested to view the previous district games on their screens, whilst others spoke to each other and their mentors about a range of topics ranging from the relevant to the banal. By the late afternoon, all tributes were ready for their interviews, and they were escorted in pairs to the Dalton studios, where they were taken to secure rooms, then held under the guard of peacekeepers whilst the studios were prepared. President Gall had in fact been advised for these interviews to go ahead without an audience, in order to not worsen the spread of the measles outbreak. However, he boldly stated that this year's games would continue like any other, and many citizens were therefore invited to watch the interviews. On the stage were the large hand chairs that were traditionally present for the interviews, whilst the screen that was used to show important moments of the games lay towards the left-hand side of the stage's back wall. There was also a large platform on the right of the stage that contained 3 raised rows, where tributes were asked to stand once they had finished their interviews. Eugenia Ravenstill began the evening's proceedings by eagerly welcoming the audience to what would be an evening like no other, and she enthused them further by making some comedic references to the previous district games. Eugenia then called for Diamond Dazzle, and a few seconds later, Dazzle marched onto the stage in a scarlet dress of flowing sheer fabrics, with glistening silver diamonds braided through her long blonde hair and the folds of this dress, which mustered loud cheers from the frenzied audience and enthusiastic compliments from Eugenia herself. It came as no surprise that Dazzle handled the following interview very well, stating that while she was pleased with her performance in the district games, she was looking forward to taking a more active role in the grand final. Eugenia also asked about her confirmed alliance with Optimo, and Dazzle immediately responded that she would honour her word and that they would be stronger together. This produced cheers from the audience, and Dazzle smiled, before shaking Eugenia's hand, then ascending the stairs of the platform and standing on the far left at the top row. Once Dazzle had left the stage, Eugenia welcomed the separator, and Optimo came out in a crisp white shirt, along with a waistcoat, trousers, and tie of matching scarlet sheer to Dazzle's dress. As Optimo reached the centre of the stage, it became clear that these clothes were also embroidered with the same glistening diamonds, and Eugenia jokingly held her hands over her neck as he came nearer. Optimo's interview got underway, and he appeared pleased to discuss his dealings with Dazzle, respectfully complimenting her performance in the district games, whilst agreeing with what she had said about their alliance. However, Optimo also stated that whilst the district games had been an interesting experience and good practice, he looked forward to winning the grand final and taking victory home to District 1, which mustered some controversial laughter from the audience as Dazzle was shown on the screen to frown, then grin slightly from the platform. After Optimo had joined Dazzle, Eugenia welcomed Lady Dalton to the stage, and Octavia confidently marched out in a white dress that was neatly covered in golden feathers, along with a golden wreath upon her head that had been shaved earlier that day. Like many of the audience, Eugenia gasped in wonder at Octavia's new haircut, but then at her dress's fine detail, and she graciously accepted the audience's applause before sitting down and appearing eager for her interview to begin. Octavia was initially asked about her legacy as a member of the Dalton family, and she stated that she was very proud not only to be representing them, but also to be bringing the title of this year's victor to her family, which would be even more of an honour than a normal victory. The screen subsequently showed Optimo and Dazzle to be rolling their eyes at each other whilst the audience laughed. Octavia then mentioned that in these games, she would also like to enjoy herself more, and for her kills to be more elaborate. Once she had been dismissed to the platform, Mighty Magnus was welcomed, and he came to the stage in a flowing white toga that was also neatly covered in golden feathers, along with a matching wreath that was placed carefully within his curly blonde locks. Magnus spent most of his interview flirting shamelessly with Eugenia, although she appeared happy to accept his compliments about her good looks, and the audience were clearly enjoying this unusual display, whilst Octavia was noted to be scowling from the platform. However, once this frivolity was over, Magnus mentioned that he was most looking forward to seeing the arena, and that once he was inside, he would win by killing as many tributes as he could in a variety of entertaining ways, which triggered further cheers from the audience. Instead of shaking Eugenia's hand, like the other tributes had done so far at the end of their interviews, Magnus kissed her on the cheek, and wolf whistles were heard amongst the laughter as Eugenia pretended to fan herself with her free hand. The next tribute to be welcomed was Glitch Silverstein, who came to the stage in a silver dress with a fascinator and necklace that were both made from coloured electric wires. However, many audience members jeered her, with some even shouting for the truth, although they were quickly silenced. It soon became clear that Glitch had lost her voice, but she appeared just about able to sign and gesture her way through the interview, with Eugenia comedically interpreting for her. When asked what the first games were like, Glitch appeared to think, but she managed to put across the message that USB was a great ally, and that they had realised something was not right in the arena. Yet when Eugenia mentioned the controversy of Glitch's win, she quietly used her voice to say that she had reached the final 2 female tributes, and that she could not help the fact that she was not shot by the Peacekeeper. The end of this response appeared to cause some confusion within the audience, but Eugenia swiftly ended the interview and a smattering of applause saw Glitch ascend the platform and hesitantly stand next to Magnus, who smirked as he looked her up and down. Lumo Harper then came to the stage amidst more jeers and shouts for the truth. He wore a matching silver suit, along with a tie and set of gloves that were also made from electric wires. Eugenia was clearly rather wary as Lumo scratched his own hands and sat down, but she remained calm and began the interview. She spent the first 2 minutes unsuccessfully trying to gauge any conversation from Lumo, but it was not until she mentioned his opponent, Diode, that he began talking extremely quickly and unintelligibly about the components of an electrical circuit for the rest of the interview, much to the bewildered amusement of Eugenia, the audience, and even the career tributes. Once Lumo had been held in place next to Glitch, Turtle Shell was called to the stage by Eugenia, and Shell came out in a light blue dress with multiple hems, along with a belt that appeared to be made of seaweed and earrings that resembled large sandy starfish. After a few questions about the district games that Shell answered in a proficient manner, Eugenia asked about her dubious alliance with Baffin that had formed at the very end of these games. Shell seemed pensive, but responded that she definitely made the right decision, and that Baffin was now like a little brother, which provoked sympathetic sounds from the audience. Yet when Eugenia proceeded to ask Shell about her habit of drawing other tributes, she became extremely guarded and was clearly uncomfortable about saying any more, which led Eugenia to end the interview soon after. Following Shell was the toxic 12-year-old, and Baffin came to the stage in a sparkling blue suit that was also decorated in seaweed and starfish. He was met with cheers and appeared merry as the interview started, before jokingly responding, "It'll be a surprise," when Eugenia asked how he would fight differently in the grand final. Yet when Baffin was asked about Shell, he seemed fazed and slowly stated that he did not want to kill her. Shell was then shown to be smiling from the platform in a bittersweet manner, until Eugenia asked Baffin if he would kill her though, to which he replied that he would, before pausing and asking why someone of his age should have to kill someone. The audience suddenly became quiet, and Eugenia frowned, but then suddenly laughed, which also made the audience laugh. The interview was ended soon after, and Baffin took his place on the far right of the podium's upper row next to Shell. After Baffin had taken Shell's hand, the Queen of Calm was called, and Solina came to the stage in a dress that appeared to be constructed from metallic silver. She also had silver braids running through her dark hair, and a matching antenna-themed fascinator on her head. As Solina walked along the stage, she smiled warmly and waved enthusiastically to the audience, before shaking Eugenia's hand and even embracing her. After a few questions about her district games, Solina stated that she was looking forward to trying her best in the grand final and entertaining the capital with her skills. When asked about Gravito, she responded that he had become a good friend and would be a valuable ally within these games, even though Glitch was shown to frown upon hearing this statement. Following Solina, Eugenia announced the next interview to be that of the Wind Twin, and Gravito was welcomed to the stage. He came out in a suit of the same silver fabric to the dress of Solina, along with a matching fascinator, although it seemed somewhat smaller upon his body compared to Solina's. Furthermore, Gravito's red hair had been cut into a coarse pattern over the sides of his head that seemed to enunciate his muscular build. Yet he seemed miserable, and it was clear that Eugenia was not looking forward to this interview. In fact, when she started by asking Gravito about his experience in the district games, he sarcastically responded, "They were good. I watched my brother die, but apart from that, they were good." The audience laughed at Gravito's tone, but he glared back at them and maintained this expression for most of the remaining interview. When asked about his chances in the grand final, he seemed particularly unbothered, to the point that the audience jeered, and as he walked up the steps of the platform, he stuck a middle finger up towards them. This triggered further outrage, and after reaching his position on the platform next to Solina, who appeared quietly irritated, a peacekeeper stood next to Gravito and pointed a gun into his back for the next few interviews. Yukon was then briskly welcomed by Eugenia, and she limped slightly as she entered the stage in a bodysuit that appeared to be made of a black tire rubber. Her chestnut afro had also been compressed and tinted black, but more noticeably on her head was the circular fascinator, which strongly resembled a steering wheel. Eugenia kindly helped Yukon to her seat, but she proceeded to give rather short and impersonal answers. A few uncomfortable silences even occurred, which would be rare for the interviews of a normal year, and Eugenia asked Yukon what was wrong. She snarled and replied that she was shot in the leg for a start. This caused a ruffle of murmurs from the audience, but Eugenia timidly responded that, in fairness, Yukon had tried to escape. However, this angered Yukon, and she asked if Eugenia would not have tried to escape as well. Eugenia briefly hesitated, until Yukon suddenly looked at the camera and shouted, "Any country watching this can free us like 14 or 12. Shouts and jeers sounded in the audience, and the camera immediately turned away from Yukon. Eugenia looked ready to respond, but Yukon shouted that the capital was killing them, and this caused further outrage as the peacekeeper came in to take her. Yukon was pulled, kicking and screaming, up the steps of the platform to stand next to Gravito, who grinned back at her, although the peacekeeper who had been guarding him from behind was now aiming his gun carefully between the pair. Meanwhile on the stage, Eugenia was trying to calm the outraged audience, and without further ado, she called the fatal flyer to the stage. Then Oregon walked out in an identical black tire bodysuit and dark leather coat, along with a matching fascinator that rested over its platinum hair. His interview was relatively uneventful compared to the two that had just occurred, and he mainly spoke about the different modes of transport within his district's games, as well as his desire to see some sort of transport within the grand final. This was clearly not the most exciting topic of conversation for Eugenia, but it was clear that she was pleased to now be dealing with a slightly less volatile tribute. The next interview was announced to be that of Soul's sister, and Olive came to the stage in a polished bark corset and brown leather skirt, along with many luscious green leaves that were placed all over these garments and within her carefully styled brown hair. This interview was surprisingly peaceful for Eugenia, and although Olive seemed aggravated to talk about her district games, she simply expressed that she wished to make both the living and fallen members of her family proud in the grand final. Eugenia even appeared slightly surprised by Olive's cooperation throughout this interview, and as Olive took her place on the platform next to Oregon, Eugenia called for the Axeman. Wynne came to the stage in a polished bark waistcoat and brown leather trousers, both of which were covered in green leaves. The interview started relatively smoothly, with Wynne stating that he was pleased to have changed minds about Olive, and that he wished to put his axe-throwing to good use in the grand final. Yet when footage of the Showdown from District 7's games was shown on the large screen, which featured the death of Wynne's ally and lover, Ivy, he became emotional, and asked Eugenia to stop showing this scene, at first quietly, but then loudly enough for some of the audience to appear worried about what he might do. It was obvious that Wynne was feeling sad about what he had just seen, but he appeared to have just about recovered his composure by the end of the interview. As Wynne mounted the platform, Olive took his hand and smiled at him supportively. The next tribute called was Needle Net, and she came to the stage in an extravagant purple velvet dress that wrapped tightly around her chest, but flowed more freely over the lower half, even forming a train behind as she walked towards Eugenia, who jokingly asked if she could have this dress. As the interview began, Net rather tactfully avoided Eugenia's question about her relationship with Bark by stating that she wished the odds be in his favour, no matter how he acts, which even gained some applause from the audience. Eugenia also asked what Net might find difficult in the grand final, and she hesitated for a moment, then calmly replied that she would think carefully before entering any new situation, and try to avoid making any rash decisions. On this note, Eugenia ended the interview, and Net left the stage to a wave of respectful applause and even some cheers. However, as Eugenia called Brutal Bark for his interview, her expression seemed to be that of preemptive dread. He entered the stage with an untucked shirt and missing buttons from his purple jacket, which produced a wave of disappointed gasps from the audience. Furthermore, Bark appeared to have wiped away the makeup that was placed over his bruised eye, which left him looking more like a rogue criminal than a district victor. Eugenia desperately tried to ask him some sensible questions, like she had been asking the other tributes, but he simply stared ahead and did not answer, which soon mustered jeers of discontent. Yet upon hearing these sounds, Bark suddenly interrupted Eugenia, and rudely shouted that he had already won his games, and so he should not have to go through it all again. As the jeering mounted, Eugenia tried to respond, but Bark suddenly stood up, turned around, and looked ready to pull down his purple trousers towards the audience, although the nearby peacekeepers quickly ran in and stopped him. The audience roared on with a few cheers, but mainly jeers, and the peacekeepers dragged Bark to the platform, eventually placing him on the right-hand side of the middle row next to Net, whilst another peacekeeper held a gun at his head. Lost Girl then followed, and this interview was also a minor disaster, albeit for different reasons. As Tritica walked onto the stage in a dress that appeared to be made of husks and corn, her pale skin and scraggly fair hair were glistening with sweat, and she seemed to be having trouble breathing as she approached Eugenia. Tritica suddenly stopped moving and fell to the floor, whilst two peacekeepers sprinted over to her with their guns at the ready. However, as sounds of shock flowed through the studios, Eugenia ran forth and surprised some of the audience by pushing in front of the peacekeepers. In order to distract both the audience and viewers from this debacle, highlights of Tritica's time in the district games were shown. Controversial murmurs rumbled throughout the audience, and Eugenia used her fan to cool Tritica, which gradually appeared to help her reanimate. However, as she looked up and saw the aliens attacking on the screen, she held her hands over her head and whimpered. Eugenia then stopped the interview, and the peacekeepers came to escort Tritica to the platform. Eugenia proceeded to call for the corn killer, and Drin came to the stage in a suit made of the same husks and corn that formed Tritica's dress. Eugenia still appeared slightly flustered, and she looked at Drin in a kind of daze as he confidently walked towards her. Drin stayed calm for most of the interview, and admitted that he would most likely not be able to hide for most of the grand final, like he had in the district games, but that he looked forward to putting a scythe to good use. Drin then seemed to be swaying his answers towards the district games, and it appeared that he was trying to not allude too much to his strategy in the grand final. Eugenia therefore asked Drin about his personal life in District 9, and as the interview came to a close, she also asked what he would say to those at home. Drin looked to the camera and addressed his husband, Tef, before saying that even though he was probably about to die, their time together had brought him enough happiness for a lifetime. Many sympathetic sounds were heard from the audience, and as Drin appeared to become more sullen, the interview was ended. The next tribute was announced to be the Stone Sister, and Clara crept onto the stage with orange bows around her fair plaits. She was adorned in a bright orange dress that also featured brown spots, which Eugenia looked at with a bemused expression, to the amusement of the audience, before suddenly appearing to realize that this pattern was supposed to resemble the spots of a cow. Clara appeared rather intimidated as Eugenia and the audience watched her intently, but she seemed to become even more fragile when Eugenia broached the subject at the end of District 10's games, and the final showdown was played on the screen, in which Clara's sister, Anna, was killed by Tobe. It did not take long for Clara to burst into tears, and Eugenia appeared to try comforting her, whilst also moving the conversation along, but through her hysteria, Clara was barely capable of speech, and for the rest of the interview, Eugenia only managed to extract from her that she would try to win, in order to make Anna proud. Clara's tears finally stopped flowing once she was stood on the rear platform next to Drin, who gave her a weak smile, but she quickly looked away. The Chain Slayer was then called, and Tobe came to the stage in an orange suit with brown spots that resembled Clara's dress, although he also wore an orange and brown eye patch that many fashion critics stated to clash against his olive skin and dark curls. The issue of Tobe's missing eye was soon addressed by Eugenia, but he responded that he would not stop trying to represent District 10 with or without two eyes, and that his experience at the local slaughterhouse would hopefully help him in his aim to win these games. Yet after a few more questions about what Tobe might be expecting in the grand final, Eugenia mentioned Anna's death, and this scene was shown on the screen. Eugenia then asked Tobe how he felt about having killed the sister of his district partner, and controversial murmurs were heard within the audience. However, Tobe screwed up his face and asked what sort of stupid question this was, which caused protest sounds from the audience. Eugenia shook her head, and he was swiftly grabbed by a peacekeeper, then pulled up the steps of the platform amidst further jeers. Tobe looked towards Clara, who was stood next to him, and she gave him a bittersweet smile, but was clearly unwilling to interact with him any further. Meanwhile on the stage, Eugenia called for Queen Bee, and Begonia came to the stage in a dazzling green dress that perfectly matched her stunning eye colour. Many fascinators and brooches that resembled bees were also placed on Begonia's braids and dress respectively, in a clear homage to one of the ways that she had won her district games. Eugenia then asked a few expected questions about Begonia's surprise relationship with Thibaut, and she replied that the games had strengthened their relationship, before showing her silver wedding ring to the camera, which produced a few quiet cheers from the audience. Without a further delay, Eugenia tried to move the conversation on to the grand final, and she asked if Begonia and Thibaut were going to be offering any more surprises. Begonia turned away and seemed pensive for a moment as a tear came to her eye, and some of the audience chuckled as Eugenia looked at her more closely. Yet Begonia then faced Eugenia again and bluntly stated that she was pregnant. Some members of the audience immediately gasped and voiced their surprise, but many more began to laugh and shout that they had heard this before, most likely in reference to the pregnancy that was announced by Peter Malark, victor of the 74th Hunger Games, to have happened to his then fiancée Katniss Everdeen, also victor at the 74th Hunger Games, during the interviews for the 75th Hunger Games, which many historians believe to have been used in a final attempt to stop this controversial quell from going ahead. Upon hearing these jeers, Begonia quickly stood up and pulled a pregnancy test from her top pocket, but it is unknown how she accessed this test. Eugenia looked around in confusion to the peacekeepers, as Begonia quickly showed it to the camera to be clear white and unused, before licking it and showing it to the camera once more, but this time it was bright pink. The camera quickly switched back to Eugenia, but it had already shown the positive pregnancy test on the screen. Upon realizing that Begonia was indeed pregnant with a baby girl, chaos erupted in the audience, with some shouting that Begonia was telling the truth, whilst others even called for the games to be stopped. Eugenia stepped forwards and tried to keep the audience calm, but a few seconds later, Begonia stepped in front of Eugenia, and as tears came to her eyes, she shouted over the chaos that her name was going to be Daisy. As the shouting continued, and Eugenia appeared more unsure of how to handle this situation, the peacekeepers on the stage suddenly stepped forwards and held their guns up towards the audience, most of whom quickly calmed down. Begonia was forcefully escorted to the platform by another peacekeeper, but before she had even climbed the first step, Thibaut ran in from the side of the stage and tackled this peacekeeper to the floor, while shouting at him to leave Begonia alone. This caused the audience to become excited once more, and some of those present were allegedly even cheering on Thibaut as he attacked the peacekeeper. However, the other peacekeepers quickly ran in and pulled Thibaut away, then he was butted in the face by one of their guns. Begonia screamed in horror, as she was practically dragged and forced into her spot next to Tobe, and the crowd and tributes alike continued shouting support for various people involved in this fight. Thibaut had already collapsed into one of the peacekeepers' arms, and he was slowly dragged along the platform's bottom row, until he was slumped next to Begonia, who held her stomach and looked down with concern towards her husband. Yet several peacekeepers were now stood at the front of the stage and pointed their guns towards the audience and the platform of tributes, which appeared to frighten not just Begonia, but many of the other tributes, most notably Shell and Tritica. Eugenia was clearly flustered at this point, and several of her curls had fallen out of place, but she quickly adjusted her earpiece and called for Lady Lupine. Delilah then came to the stage in a sparkling light blue cloak that was based on the traditional uniform of the nurses in District 12. Eugenia proceeded to ask a few standard questions about Delilah's district games, to which she responded that she was simply going to last long enough to outwit the others. Yet shortly after she had stated that her district partner, Ristoro, had become a good friend, someone in the audience suddenly shouted out, asking if Delilah had killed Peacekeeper Cardew in reference to Delilah's alleged involvement in his death several weeks prior. However, before she could react, waves of controversy flowed through the audience, and the man who asked this question was removed by peacekeepers. After calming the audience once again, Eugenia exhaustedly ended Delilah's interview, and she half-heartedly welcomed the menace. Rostoro then came to the stage in a sparkling outfit that was clearly based on the male version of District 12's nursing uniform, but Eugenia hardly looked at him as he approached her. A few of the usual questions ensued, until Rostoro impatiently interrupted and asked if these games really needed to happen. Jeers were heard once more, and contrary to her usually positive disposition, Eugenia had clearly run out of patience at this point. She gritted her teeth and forced a smile, before glaring at Ristoro and forcefully stating that these games would make for a great spectacle. Yet as the audience applauded, Ristoro snarled back at Eugenia and gestured towards Begonia, who was still crying on the platform. He then asked, even though she's pregnant? And a mixture of loud reactions were heard in the audience, whilst Eugenia silently glared at him. Peacekeepers approached Ristoro, pulled him from the chair, and escorted him to the platform, amidst more noise. As he stood in the bottom right position next to Delilah, she patted him on the back and smiled. Begonia also peered out from along the row and nodded to Ristoro in appreciation. Eugenia then stood up in fatigue, and appeared pleased to announce the next interview to be that of former game maker Artulia Fling. As the audience excitedly applauded, Artulia came to the stage in a white suit, and she and Eugenia kissed each other on the cheek and sat down for the interview to begin. Eugenia asked Artulia a little about the district games so far, including what had impressed her, and what she looked forward to seeing in the grand final. Yet after giving some rather enlightening answers, Artulia stated that she had an important announcement to make. The audience voiced their curiosity, and Eugenia jokingly ordered Artulia to not leave them in suspense any longer. She stood up and stated that she had accepted President Gall's invitation to be the game maker for the grand final, and gasps in the audience were quickly followed by excited cheers and applause. However, when the camera showed the platform of tributes, many of them appeared even more anxious, and some looked at each other in fear. It is also believed by historians that Game Maker Fling was placed in this position by President Gall following the security breach that had occurred during District 3's games, as he most likely trusted her to not be a member of Unidad. Once the audience were quiet again, Eugenia asked if Artulia could reveal anything about the games. She grinned and turned around towards the tributes, then back to Eugenia, and announced that the arena was a place that dreams are made of. This seemed to cause confusion within the audience, and the screen quickly showed the tribute platform, where some appeared more scared, others appeared perplexed, but the career tributes excitedly discussed between themselves what this could mean. At that moment, Eugenia seemed to hear something on her earpiece, and she asked if these games would be affected at all by the current measles outbreak, to which Artulia grinned and answered that someone else would be able to answer this question. As Eugenia frowned, President Gall marched onto the stage to a few cheers, but unfortunately more jeers, and even a few shouts of murderer. The peacekeepers were unfortunately forced to point their guns at the audience, but once silence resumed, Gall greeted both Artulia and Eugenia. He proceeded to sit down in another chair that was quickly wheeled in, and Eugenia asked if he had enjoyed the district games, to which he replied that they were too great to ever forget. Eugenia repeated her question about the measles outbreak, and Gall proudly stood up, before stating in a confident and booming voice that Panem would always soldier onwards and excel to greatness, and that neither Panem's citizens nor the Hunger Games themselves would be threatened by illness, war, or foreign radicalism. Although this speech was initially met with jeers, a gradual increase in cheers and applause followed. Yet at this time, the screen was not showing that several tributes appeared to have adverse reactions to this speech, including Bark and Thibault, who were each glaring at Gall from the platform. Thibault had quietly awoken during the speech, and was now standing next to Begonia once more. In fact, as the speech ended, she noticed Thibault gritting his teeth and forming a fist. Begonia put her hand on his shoulder, but he quickly pounced onto the nearest peacekeeper in front of the platform. At this moment, chaos erupted on the stage, as Bark and Gravito also attacked the peacekeepers that were stood next to them on the platform, and several tributes were subsequently knocked off their rows and into each other as they backed away from these fights. The audience excitedly cheered and jeered, whilst many of the other peacekeepers pushed tributes out of the way as they ran across the platform to control these fights. This saw several tributes falling into and onto each other, whilst Gravito was even pushed into Solina, who fell off the left side of the platform and onto a peacekeeper with enough force to break his helmet. Most of the audience were now on their feet, in order to have a decent view of this pandemonium. Chief Peacekeeper Snow was also shouting at his squad to not shoot the tributes with the guns, but only with the tasers, presumably so that they were not affected for the games the next day. Eugenia, Artulia, and Gall were watching the scene in horror from the centre of the stage, and Gall appeared to notice Net being tasered by a peacekeeper and falling onto Delilah, which knocked her head against the floor. Thibault ran forwards and quickly helped Delilah and Net, but he then looked up to see Gall grinning and even chuckling a little. As the sound of the audience's reaction became even louder, Thibault snarled and sprinted towards Gall. A peacekeeper that was stood near the centre of the stage quickly noticed Thibault approaching, and he ran towards Gall, then hurried him off the stage and into the audience. Meanwhile, at the back of the stage, another peacekeeper shot his gun towards Thibault, but he unfortunately missed, and the bullet hit the head of a young lady in the third row of the audience. The excited cheering in this section of the audience suddenly morphed into screams of terror as this lady fell to the floor, and a man who was revealed to be her husband shouted in anger, and sprinted towards the stage. He ran towards the peacekeeper that had just shot his wife, but this peacekeeper shot several bullets at him as well, some of which passed through his body and hit more members of the audience. Chief Peacekeeper Snow quickly turned and shot this peacekeeper, but many of the audience were already screaming in terror or running onto the stage in protest, whilst many were even beginning to flee through the aisles, which caused some to fall and become crushed in the stampedes that followed. At this point, the transmission was finally cut on Capitol TV, and the studios were plunged into darkness as the tributes were forcefully removed from the stage. However, this further exacerbated the panic in the audience and the severity of the stampedes, which caused countless injuries and a total of 136 fatalities to occur that night. The violence also spread to the streets of the Capitol over the next few hours, with more damage, injuries, and even deaths being reported across the city. Many protesters were also calling for the games to be cancelled, whilst others burned pictures of President Gall. That night, the streets within 200 meters of the accommodation tower were closed off by peacekeepers, and the tributes were all kept under strict guard in their apartments. The next morning, they were all awoken before sunrise and taken to the roof of the tower, where they were placed in the hovercraft that left without any further delay and headed for the arena as the sun rose in the distance. The craft arrived just over an hour later, and once the tributes had each been placed in their individual holding rooms, they were ordered to dress in the black jackets, t-shirts, trousers and boots that were provided. Many appeared to expect their mentors to visit them, but due to the events of the previous night, the mentors were all still under guard within the Capitol. Most tributes therefore spent the time before the games practicing their fighting skills, trying to remain calm, crying to themselves, or even sleeping. 5 minutes before midday, the tributes were finally called to their tubes, and despite a few weak protests, they entered without major incident. The last few minutes then passed quietly, and shortly before noon itself, the tubes rose into the cornucopia clearing.